So the zero aggression principle says that you may not initiate or threaten to initiate physical aggression against the person or property of another. That's it. It's very simple. Now, if somebody said, why, which is not an unreasonable question. I mean, suppose I'm bigger than you and stronger than you, and you've got something I want, and I can take it from you. I go, hey, zero aggression principle, who cares, right? I'm going to take it. So, I mean, and you're there protesting as I hold you down with my foot in your neck and take you running off with your goods. And I go, zap, smap, who cares, right? So the question is, what kind of justification can you give for this principle? Now, before I come to my answer to that question, I think you have to realize, and other people have to realize, that in any area of human inquiry, there are always things that are taken for granted. There is no completely neutral starting point, right? Whatever it is, you have to stand somewhere. You have to take something for granted. Other things being equal, I think it would be good to take the fewest things as possible for granted, because I could have an incredibly rich theory which has, I don't know, 5,493 principles. And I'm taking them all for granted. And you go, oh, okay, that seems a little bit kind of ad hoc. Right? Okay, so I'm working with one. And so if you can justify this in one way, so you can justify it on broadly utilitarian grounds. That is to say, you can justify it on the grounds that if it is followed, it will bring about consequences that in the aggregate are beneficial to rather than detrimental to people. Okay, and so and that's not mad. I mean, you know, we make these kind of cost-benefit decisions about many things on a day-to-day basis. It's perfectly reasonable in some areas of life. But there is another approach to decision-making, both in ethics and in economics, but particularly in ethics for the moment, where the answer to the question doesn't seem to be properly given if you try to do it in terms of consequences. So let me take a sort of an example here. Suppose you're walking down the street with your friend and you find some adult sticking pins in the eyes of a very small child. And you probably say, hello, I don't think you should do that. And the person then would say, well, why is that? And you go, well, and while you're thinking of an answer and your friend says, oh, well, you know, I'm a utilitarian. You know, there's a balance of pleasure over pain and all of the rest, and the child is in a lot of pain. And therefore, you know, when you take all that into account, this is a bad thing to do. But then the assailant with the pin says, well, I get a huge amount of pleasure out of this. I'm I'm a weird guy. Okay, and so the kid is screaming in pain. So what? I mean, the more he screams, the more pleasure I get. So on my world, the balance of pleasure over pain comes solidly down on the pin sticking exercise. I, on the other hand, would say, I don't give a tuppenny damn about what the balance of pleasure and pain is here. There are some things that are simply not right to do, right? Regardless of the consequences, right? And so when it comes to the zero aggression principle, I would defend it on the grounds, I would say you can defend it in a utilitarian way if you choose, but you give hostage to fortune if you do so. Because if anyone could ever demonstrate that the implementation of the zero aggression principle actually led, in fact, to less flourishing rather than more flourishing, then you are intellectually obliged to give it up. Mm-hmm. And I'm not prepared to do that. Because to me, while I actually believe that it does actually lead to an increase in benefits over disbenefits, right, as a matter of fact, but that's not why I'm pushing it. I'm pushing it because I think it is right to do so. Now, what happens if somebody denies it? I'm not talking practically, but rather conceptually. Well, let's take the example of the principle of contradiction that we find in Aristotle. Aristotle says that a proposition cannot both be true and false in the same respect at the same time, right? And suppose somebody says, oh, well, I reject that. Now, you've got a problem here, because in order to reject a proposition, you have to assert it's contradictory. But if you're rejecting the principle of non-contradiction, the only way you can do so is by making implicit use of the principle of contradiction. So you're stuck, right? There's no coherent way to reject the principle of non-contradiction. What about ZAP? What about the zero aggression principle? Are you stuck in the same way? Is it incoherent in the same way? And the answer is no. It would be nice if it were, but it's not. But if somebody really rejects the zero aggression principle, and I don't mean just, you know, in an argument or just to annoy you or because it's 12 and you're having pizza and he just wants to wind you up, but really somebody like Max Stirner in the 19th century, who effectively is one of the few people who actually does that, right? Then what you have to say to him is, okay, well, what you're saying isn't incoherent. It's not self-contradictory. It's not, in that sense, intellectually self-destructive. But what it means is that if you reject the zero aggression principle, you have no principled ground on which to stand if somebody uses force or violence against you in situations other than where you are aggressing. You can obviously physically resist. Of course you can physically resist, but you can never say you shouldn't do that. You cannot use normative language because you've rejected the zero aggression principle. And so my challenge to somebody who rejects the zero aggression principle is, okay, friend, let me see you live that out. Okay, and I used to, in my class on anarchy law in the state, I used to sort of try to exemplify this by going to one of the students and saying, Tim, can I borrow your pen for the moment? And he goes, oh, sure, Professor. And then I would take it. And then while I continued to talk, I would put it in my pocket. And I would look at his face. And he's going, what? And he's thinking, how can I ask him for it back politely? And I go, oh, sorry, was there a problem? And he goes, well, yeah, you've got my pen. And I go, so? Right. And that's so, I mean, so everybody and anybody who wants to say you've got my pen, okay, meaning give it back to me, is making use of the zero aggression principle. Okay, and if you're not prepared to accept it, you have to be prepared to have somebody bash you on the head and steal your stuff and not have a principled leg to stand on.